was an accident, in the sense I was working in theatre, and I met some people who were running a community art project. By chance, there was a job going that I wouldn't have applied for if I hadn't met them, because it was called a community arts apprentice, community arts worker. And I wouldn't have known what that meant. This is 1981. So it was by chance, really, genuinely a matter of luck, being in the right place and at the right time. Although I think that things are less chance than we sometimes think they are, because sometimes you see the opportunities that you're looking for, even though you don't know you're looking for them. And the ones that you're not looking for, you walk past and you don't notice. That's the practical answer. The more the deeper answer, I suppose, is because I was interested in art. I thought it was what I understood best, and at the same time, I wanted to do something that was useful in the world. And so, when I came across community art, that was it fulfilled that, both of those things.
Interesting. So when you mention community art, like, what is that to you? And like, so you worked with an array of people over the last 20, 30 years, fielding from people of the opera world, and then people of the older generation and stuff like that. So in terms of community art, why community art, and what is it to you, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, as I explain in the book, I think community art is not a different way of doing conventional art forms. I think it's a different kind of art form, because it is always involves people with different types of knowledge, different types of skill, different reasons for being there, but wanting to create a piece of art through their work together. Yeah. And that is fundamentally different because of that coming together of different kinds of people, to anything that happens in the professional art world, or indeed in the amateur art world. What is it to me? Above all, it is a force for development and emancipation. But it's a force that, or I'm not sure if force is the right word. Maybe it's a path or a means or a resource, that's better. But it's something that people use. It's not something that I, as a community arts worker, I don't do anything to people. I just make available this resource. And how people use it, what they use it for, is up to them. And that's deeply unpredictable, both the work that will be produced and what will come out of it. So I often compare it in making a distinction between what I would call community art and participatory art. It's a bit like the difference between improvised music and composed music. Community art is always improvisation. There is no score before you start. And what happens is entirely dependent on who has come together to create this piece of music.
That's interesting, because in the workshop so the participants just were a part of, I actually recently got educated in long form improvisation, and I tested it out in the group there. So you mentioned that is actually a bit mad. And that was the first time I've ever done it in this kind of, with a group of artists or art educators as well, which is really interesting. There's this thing in your regular Marvels, and there's two questions you ask. You probably I've been thinking about them the last day or two. If art is important, like, so I suppose I just want your kind of perspective on this. Why is it not accepted as a valid way to understand art experience? if people are important, why not write about their experience in ways they might read?
So after about 15 years of doing community arts work full-time and only community arts work, I began to do more writing and research about this practice. And I had to learn a lot to do that, and it was very interesting and exciting in lots of ways. But after, again, about 15 years of doing research work, those were the two questions that I asked myself. Why, given that people working in art with other people, whether it's participatory art, whether it's community art or something else, given that they are so frequently required to evaluate and research and report on their work, to me paradoxical that we only used the methods and ideas of social sciences, sometimes even natural sciences and management theory, and didn't use the ideas and concepts of art as a way to understand, given that the only reason we were doing the work was because we thought art was important. And then the second thing was I became aware that although my writing, I've always worked hard to make my writing as accessible as possible, I could still see a significant difference in the working as a community artist. The point of that work was always to make art and ideas accessible to people and usable by them. And yet the disciplines of research put barriers in the way of that work. So yeah, I was researching and writing about people's experience of art, but I didn't think that most of the people that I whose work or experiences I wrote about would ever read what I wrote. And so the Regular Marvels project was an attempt to solve both of those conundrums at once. It was moving away from conventional research methodologies and strategies to use strategies that were more literary, more artistic, and also to work with artists on each of those projects, so that in each case I worked with a visual artist, tell the story through their work as well as through the words that I was using.
It's fascinating. And then, so in relation to that, then you create like use and ornaments. Like that was a massive study over like one of the biggest. It's like one of the probably the biggest art studies in the UK. And like
yeah, that's kind of the wrong order. It was so use or ornament I did about 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was the first or one of the first big pieces of research that I did.
Yeah.
And to some extent, the Regular Marvels idea was a reaction against that, precisely because use or ornament was aspiring to I'm not an academic, I've never been an academic, but it was aspiring to those kinds of models of knowledge making. And it took me some time after that to question some of the power in those models, and some of their exclusivity and some of their blind spots.
Yeah, you mentioned blind spots. So what is your understanding of that? Like, so kind of when you mentioned
By
that
definition, I don't know what blind spots are, because they're all the things that I don't know.
yeah, okay, very good. So what's like, so pros and cons of community art from your experience?
I saw that when you sent me this. I don't know any cons. I mean, I've spent 40 years working in this field. I couldn't have wanted anything better to do with my life. For me, I'm not saying it's good for everyone, but it's what I want to do. The only cons there are are the cons that are with everything, which is if you do it badly or you do it for the wrong reasons, by which I mean for reasons which pull against the integral reasons and purposes of the form itself, then you will do bad work, and you may cause damage to people, you may hurt people. But largely, you know, the worst that I've seen happen in community arts is that it's a bit disappointing, you know, which frankly, in the way of the world, is not a really terrible thing to happen to us.
Meaning there's no results really.
Sorry?
There's no results, or there's no kind of
No, well, you see, I don't. There's a. I'm not doing this for results. I don't have a. I'm doing it. I often say my work is rights based. I'm doing it because I think people have a right to make art on their own terms for reasons and purposes that belong to them, not to me. I think there very often are results and outcomes and change that comes from that, but it's not something that I have intended or made happen. It's what everybody makes happen by being involved in creating art together. Disappointing is probably more just that, you know, the work doesn't really sing. You know, it's kind of okay, but and you know, that's, as I say, in the scale of the things that are wrong with the world, that's not a terrible thing to go through. It just means you have to think about it and work out why it doesn't work, and that will enable you to do something better next time.
Exactly. Very good points. But then, like you've worked in an array of different countries and with different projects, going from museums and to opera, and to trying to work with different creative kind of individuals all around Europe. So what's your, obviously you just said there, your process is kind of, it's a kind of a fluke. It just happens, and you're kind of documenting this as you go along, and then you create a sequence and augment it into a book.
I wouldn't call it fluke. I think that the work that I've done, the heart of it is it's probably principally about listening to people.
Yeah.
I don't usually start with ideas. Sometimes I'll have an idea, but only because sometimes it's difficult to get people interested if there isn't something to get them interested in.
Yeah.
But that idea may or may not be what eventually ends up happening.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about the people that I would work with at the beginning of working with them, and that's as true. I mean, the first time I went to work in Southeast Europe was about a bit more than 20 years ago, and I'd been asked to do a 3-day training workshop, and it was very clear to me, having never set foot in Macedonia before, that I knew nothing about it, and I couldn't go there and tell people about their projects or what they should do. All I can do is listen and try and understand, and then make connections with other things that I know, and make available the resources, the experiences, the ideas that I have, in ways that people may find them useful to their own situations. But that's what's so exciting about the work. I mean, for instance, I spent 2 years working with the lawnmowers, which is an independent theatre group of people with learning difficulties that I've known for nearly 30 years, which is about how long they've existed. They're in Gateshead, and when I say I spent 2 years working with them, they're a really busy bunch of people. I was working with 5 people who are all in from their 40s to their 50s, and they wanted to work on what started was a project. It was going to be a piece of theatre about growing older as a person with learning difficulties. It ended up being a film that emerged over a period of time. We worked once a month for a full day on Saturdays, and that's what I mean. I mean, I don't know anything about what it means to grow older as a person with learning difficulties. So we had to work together, we had to listen to each other, we had to research, we had to we brought in other people who had expertise in some of the issues involved, and out of that and their experience came a story, and there were some things that I brought into that, and then out of that we realized it would make a better film than it would be a play. So there isn't a process except I suppose the value of careful listening and trusting that something will always happen, because it always does if you allow it to happen. So you have to not panic that I haven't produced anything yet. We probably spent 9 months floundering about, not really knowing where we were going.
It's interesting you say that, because like obviously there's different levels to art creation when you're constrained by educational institutes. So when I was doing my master's in socially engaged art, and there's two of the people I work with went on the MA or on the call, they would have noticed, and I said like I don't have a process, I just have an idea, and I just want to work with these groups, and I want to create something. And my lecturer's like, you can't do that because it's not possible. And it's like, it's not possible because you're constrained by a brief. But in my head it was possible because the process was me working with these groups and I'll prompt them in different ways.
I am aware, and I feel very lucky that I learned my trade, if you like, in a time that was very unconstrained by a lot of processes. There were big weaknesses to that. I mean, there were no child protection policies, there were no risk assessments, there was nothing. There wasn't a national curriculum at the time, so you could go into a school and propose a project, and if the teacher wanted to do it, then that was fine. You could, take over the classroom. So I'm always conscious that part of my expectations, part of my thinking, part of my way of working was shaped in a world that no longer exists. And it doesn't reflect how younger people now are obliged to work. You have to have learning outcomes, you have to have all sorts of lesson plans. I mean, to be honest, I don't know if I would have gone into this field if I had had to work in that way, because it just temperamentally I'm not suited to it.
Yeah, and I suppose in communication with you, I don't think I was ever suited to it, but I think I needed to in order to achieve what I wanted to achieve, and obviously generate my ideas, especially in relation to the project systems that I'm kind of working with now. It's just, I suppose I have that difficulty. Like funders, like, what's the point if there's no goal? We need goals. Like, and it's like, no, but there's no. The process is this idea, and mixing development education and social art practice together. That's a process. Like, that's instrumental to the learning outcomes by working with these individuals and educators that are connected to these individuals. If you kind of understand.
You see, when I was young and learning about some of this stuff, Augusto Boal and Paulo Freire were very influential figures the community art movement, and we were very much. I think we very much believed in the idea that education was a collective and mutual process in which everybody could set the goals, discover what they, go in pursuit of what they wanted to discover.
Yeah.
And that's why I remain committed to the idea of that people take out of this what they want, what they're looking for,
Yeah.
not anything that I'm giving them. I very firmly resist the idea that it's my job, or more importantly, that I have any right to try and shape anyone else's experience or their learning or whatever. I mean, why would, if somebody invited me to be involved in a theatre project, and I discovered halfway through that they had some kind of goal that how they were going to change me,
Yeah.
I'd be livid.
Yeah, no.
I mean, so why would I think that was something I'd be entitled to do to someone else?
No, yeah. And that's where my thinking is completely at. And I suppose, again, you mentioned learning outcomes, but I put it down to simply, like, I had this argument with lecturers, like, essay writing, like, there's a form to essay, there's an art to essay writing, but I was like, I want to question essay writing because I want to do it differently, and it's obviously not possible because in a simple way, because we're constrained by an idea that essay writing is a process and you need to go through it. But my mind didn't. I suppose I obviously ended up doing the essay, but like,
there's a really nice Peanuts cartoon from about 1970, and it's important that it's from about 1970 because it's about these ideas, and it has a couple of characters. I'm not very familiar with Peanuts, so I can't tell you who they are. But there's a girl talking, and she says, what did you do in school today? And she said, oh no, she says, I signed up for country dancing, stained glass making, and folk singing, or something like that.
Yeah.
And what did you do? I did double maths and science or whatever. And then the other person says, so what did you learn today? I learned that what you sign up for and what you get are two different things. You'll have to look up the original cartoon strip. I might have it somewhere. If I've got it, I'll send it to you because it's much better written than I've just misremembered it.
Exactly. Elise just put something into the group. She said, does ego get in the way of that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously we all have a certain amount of ego.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I mean, there are people who go into community art who have big egos. I've known and sometimes admired them. But I'm not sure that if you're really about you and your ideas and your work, you're likely to be very drawn to that kind of practice. But equally, I think it's important to be honest and to be truthful. One of in the 80s, I used to sometimes meet people who were very, I think, almost puritanical about their reluctance to influence the work of the people they were working with. And I think they were wrong. I'm never forgot one person who claimed never even to express an opinion about the work that somebody had done. Because I think the point is, if I'm working with a group, if I'm there, then first of all, I'm there as an equal member of the group.
Yeah.
Which means that I have the same right to express my opinion about what's happening as everyone else does.
Yeah.
If I don't, then I'm somehow othering myself and withdrawing myself and not giving people access to the skills that I bring. in the same way that they bring skills
Mm.
to that, they bring a whole range of skills. It only works if we're willing to share and be open and honest about our skills. But yeah, I don't, in terms of that ego, I don't have a practice. I don't use that word about what I do, and I don't consider myself or call myself an artist. I only describe myself as a community artist because I don't do any work on my own. I only work with people, and therefore there is no interest in me. I have no nobody would ever write a monograph about my work the way they would write about a visual artist or a theatre director, because there's nothing to write about because my work doesn't exist.
It does. It does exist.
I grant you, some of my writing exists, but most of my community art work doesn't exist like that. And yeah, there's a certain amount of exist. I mean, the writing exists, and I'm not saying I've no ego. Of course, we all have ego. It's a necessary part of psychology.
But
yeah, sorry, go on.
No, sorry. It was just at least actually meant that does it interfere with the process of being so open and open-ended in this or something? I think.
I'm not sure it's ego that interferes. I think there's a what can be difficult is the sense of obligation, the sense of needing to produce something, to deliver something that. So maybe it's ego in the sense that you want people to think you've done a good job at the end of it. But that in itself is a really interesting question. You see, I think I wrote about this on the blog a few years ago in framing the question: to whom do you give the power to legitimize your work? And I frame it like that because that's what you're doing. When you're saying somebody else can validate or legitimize you're actually giving them power over your work. And for me, I have to say the only people who really matter are the people that I've worked with. So if you go back to the Lawnmowers, the film that we made, which I think is great, I love it, but I love it because the 5 performers and co-writers of it and devisers of it are really proud of it and like it, and it says what they want it to say. If they were not happy with it, it really wouldn't matter what anybody else outside the project told me. Another community artist or a I don't know, somebody from a foundation or a funder might say this is a really good piece of work. But if I know that the people I've been working with are unhappy or dissatisfied or disappointed, in that word I used before, then I think that's a real problem. And equally, if the people who've been working on the project are proud of it and happy with it, then by all means, we'll always listen to people from outside who don't get it or don't think it's very good. But it won't change our opinion unless they can demonstrate to us why we're wrong in thinking that it's a good piece of work.
Yeah. So you're like, I wrote down a few things here, just saying like, you're obviously in a way you're a facilitator of the multiple intelligence. So people that are from all around different contexts, different experiences, different conditions, and you're kind of enforcing divergent thinking in the space, and then in a way, and then you're kind of, so your form of art is subjective to the eye of the beholder in a way.
Which form of art isn't?
I know that. I know. Yeah, but it's to me it's brilliant because it exists in my thinking as well, which is it's
Yeah.
not the air,
I
but
mean, I think that's fine. The only thing I kind of gulped at is when you used the word enforcing. I hope I'm never enforcing anything.
yeah, maybe it was the wrong word.
I think a lot about words. They matter a lot to me because they speak about how we see things. So, for instance, I I used the word impact for for many years because I kind of inherited it. It was the word that was used,
Yeah,
but I had to as I thought more about it, I realized what a problematic word it is because it implies um, it almost it makes it implies a force. I mean, that's what it literally means. It implies a force striking an object. That's what an impact is. And if policymakers really think that that's what their job is, to have an impact on people,
yeah.
what does that say about how they position themselves and how they see the people that they're working with? It's certainly not a relationship of equality or mutual respect.
Mm.
So yeah, I think words matter. They help us question how we're thinking about things.
What's your favorite word?
That's a great question. I have no idea. I have
Oh, I
no
have to.
idea. I have no idea. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't have a favorite word. I think I maybe have a favorite attitude, which is kind of it's maybe my favorite word is why, and my favorite attitude is how. That you say, okay, well, how are we going to do this?
Yeah,
Because you meet a lot of people who think, well, why we shouldn't do this, or it's too difficult. And I think all the best things come from just working out how to do things. Sometimes, I mean, some of the things we tried to do when I was young and even more naive. I remember we once tried to do for no really very good reason. We once tried to make a 19th century costume drama on video. This was in like 1983 when video was really hard to use.
yeah.
And we we made a few scenes and we had some fun, but actually we thought not only have we tried to do something that is far beyond our capabilities, um, but actually we've forgotten why we wanted to do it in the first place. So we just stopped it and decided to do something else.
Well, that's the whole idea, isn't it? But you had the freedom to play with that, I suppose.
Yeah.
Whereas artists now probably don't have the freedom to play with. Well, they do and they don't.
There's a lot less freedom, and part of what I would be trying to do now in a world where one of the reasons we had freedom is because in the 70s and 80s is because nobody thought the work we were doing mattered, nobody thought it was any good, and therefore they didn't give it any attention or often any money. And there's a chapter in the book that I called "Without Help, Without Permission," and those two things go together for me. If you don't ask for help, you don't need to ask for permission either. And we often worked with a bit of help and a bit of permission in those ambiguous days. But I think mostly people had little time or respect for community art at the time. Therefore, we were left largely to our own devices. Nowadays, now that funders and cultural institutions and others have bought into all this and arguably are trying to appropriate it if they haven't already, a large part of what I'm trying to do is to make an argument to them that they will if they do that, they will destroy the thing that they think they're trying to have, because they will just it doesn't work if you over organize it and turn it into a kind of I don't know, a kind of adult education for people who don't go to adult education.
Mm. Well, I think that is happening in a way.
It is, and it needs to be resisted.
Especially in Ireland, because it's definitely happening in terms of funding applications, things like these arts council. We probably not familiar, but they're probably the biggest kind of funders in terms of the arts in Ireland, and they have their own everything about them is now that they're their own kind of entity in relation to funding and education, all that, all the instrumental elements to what makes up an artist.
I knew the Arts Council in Ireland, 20 or more years ago, but haven't had much to do with them more recently. I wrote a paper for them then about criteria for assessing artistic quality that they used for many years.
Right. I was not aware of that. No way.
Yeah. I've done a lot of things.
I know you've done. I know you. And
but those criteria, you can find them in A Restless Art and the reference to the paper that I wrote for the Arts Council. So I mean, they're 5 simple ideas, which were, if you're talking about just the artistic quality, nothing else of something, then I was suggesting that these 5 qualities, the 5 criteria, would help you have a better conversation about why you thought something had quality and why I might think differently about it. So they were, the words have changed a bit over the years. I'm not sure what the original words were, but today I'd call them craft or technique, ambition, originality, resonance, and magic or feeling. That, in other words, a work could be good if it would be great if it had all 5 of those things. It could be outstanding if it had only one. Work can have enormous resonance and be technically weak, not very original, not very ambitious, but because it's in the context that it's in, for the people it's speaking to, it can be absolutely transformative. And one example of that, I've always thought some of the punk bands were very much like that in the 70s.
Yeah.
Not much technique, not much originality, not much ambition, but they changed the world more than many far more skilled and gifted musicians did, because they were the right artists at the right moment to speak to the whole generation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, obviously, I can only do that as an onlooker, that experience. So back to A Restless Art, like that chapter 4 obviously fascinates me in a way, especially in relation to my work, and your breakdown of it even more fascinates me, I suppose, because it kind of really resonates with my own work and my own thinking regarding systems. Especially like you're obviously mentioning these things as we go on, like why make participatory art, like so my old idea of my own theory of change is that I want people in the room that don't want to be in the room. If you understand, like I want people that hate being in a space, a learning space and learning environments, so I can change that. And I suppose, like, what would you be your thinking regarding in that? Because I got it from
I get my head around that one.
Yeah. So like I get what you mentioned, that idea of having people in the room and working with them and seeing the process, and again what magic can come out of it, or for any magic at all.
Yeah, I think I've never wanted to work with people who who didn't want to work with me. I think that that's the starting point. We want to do something.
Yeah.
Might not have the same idea of what we want to do. Our ideas of what we want to do might change through our working together. But I'm not sure. I mean, I have occasionally worked. So I've worked in prisons. First time I worked in a prison, I had 12 men, and I had 5 days to do a screen printing workshop with them. And you know, that was tough because none of them, they had very, very different reasons for being there, not necessarily anything to do with wanting to do screen printing. Wanting to be somewhere else was as is often a good reason for people to be in an art workshop in a prison.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, fortunately, if the ideas are interesting, people are drawn in and want to find a way to make this experience meaningful for them. But that's what I mean. They have to find the way. I have to help them find the way if I can.
Yeah.
If they can't see it. But in the end, I think a lot about the difference between teaching and learning. You know, I don't think I've ever taught anyone anything. I hope I've never taught anyone anything. Equally, I hope that people have learned during the things, because I've certainly learned a lot in the things that I've done.
Yeah.
But learning is something that's self-directed, self-motivated. And I think the things that we learn, we never forget. We integrate them. They change us as people. Things we're taught are often things we carry around with us, and we often wish we didn't have to carry around with us because they've kind of been given to us.
Yeah. And then, so your kind of like your mechanism or your method model of like cultural democracy, cultural democratization, and social change, all these three things are instrumental to participatory art, and you've obviously mentioned like a lot of them. So how did you identify?
It's not okay. I mean, when I talk about cultural democratization and cultural democracy, or access to culture, which is an alternative way of talking about cultural democratization, these are not things that I invented. These are the basic foundations of cultural policy in Europe since the Second World War.
Yeah.
So cultural democratization came with the emergence of the welfare states following the Second World War. The idea that the state ought to provide culture for people. And to some extent, Western European states did it because their great rival and alternative in the Soviet sphere were doing it. Then cultural democracy emerged in the 1970s. And as far as I know, the first time that phrase is used is in a Council of Europe conference in 1974, which I write about in the book. But the difficulty, democratization of culture is easy to understand as a concept. It's very straightforward. Culture is a good thing, therefore we as a government or a state should give people access to it. So we'll build theatres, we'll fund the arts, we'll make it possible for people to enjoy what Matthew Arnold called the best that man has done and thought, or something like that. Cultural democracy emerged, like community art, as an idea that it emerged following the 1960s, because part of what the 1960s was doing was rejecting what was seen to be the paternalism of cultural democratization.
Mm.
They were saying, young people in the 60s were saying, ironically, of course, they had benefited from 20 to 30 years of cultural democratization.
Mm.
So that first generation of community artists were the, were the first, often in their families, to have gone to art school or gone to university. They'd had a healthcare system. They'd had much greater prosperity and full employment. So that made them able to challenge the idea that you should go to the gallery and like what's there because it's good for you.
Mm.
And that challenge, which exploded in all the cultural revolution of the 1960s and created community art as part of that explosion, then the policy response to that was what they call cultural democracy, which is, okay, we have to not simply tell people and provide art for people. We have to listen to what people want to do themselves. We have to recognize that they already have art and culture, that it's not simply something that we're taking to them. That idea is one that I agree with largely, but it is a much more complex idea than simply the idea that art is good for people and therefore we just need to give them more of it.
Mm.
Because it's not so easy to understand. It opens up questions about what is good and what isn't good. Are there different, does some art have more value than others? Does all art need support? Why would it need support from the state? Arguably, it's much better if it can survive without the state getting involved in it. So there's a whole set of complicated questions around cultural democracy, but they don't worry me in the sense that I, like all democracy, the arguing and the settling and the negotiating of different visions and different meanings about what we're here for and what we want and what is good is exactly what we need democracy for. Because otherwise, if we don't argue about it ourselves as citizens, then the alternative is that somebody will tell us what's good for us.
Yeah, that's what's happening, I suppose. Right now. So like Francois, like I could talk to you all day, but I'm gonna open the conversation to the rest of the participants if they want to ask any questions. If not, I've loads more.
You've all been very patient, looking.
I have wanted to ask something, so I'm going to jump straight in now that I've been given the chance, if that's okay, Francois. Thank you so much. I find it really inspiring, but particularly because of the integrity with which you have kind of approach your way of working. I was struck by something you said actually quite early on in the conversation, in relation to, I actually made a note about it, the kind of point of community art being that it's accessible and usable, and the research processes that we often bring in that, you know, are not so accessible or useful. And arts practices research is doing an awful lot of that. We're seeing it more and more as the field becomes professionalized. It's something I kind of struggle with, I guess, in my own work as well. And I'm actually in prep mode for presenting a project that I've been working in a community context with for 2 years. I developed a collective, and on Tuesday I'll present the work in a field of sort of professionals for some feedback and support. And I suppose I've just invited the community members into that conversation because I felt it necessary that they were there to witness the conversation, to participate in it, to know what was being said within another field about it. And I wonder how maybe you've approached that, because you are obviously, you're working in lots of different ways. You're working in community contexts, but you're also, you're there in the professional field, and you're researching and writing about it too. So in terms of working on projects, do you do that? Do you invite people in? Do you mix rooms where you're kind of amalgamating everything together? How do you approach that?
In the last 10 years, since I kind of liberated myself from the idea that it was my job to meet an ideal standard of what research was, I felt able to be much more playful and exploratory in both in the artwork and in how to research it and how to tell its stories. And I've been experimenting, testing out ideas of involving people as co-researchers in the project. So, for example, I was asked to help support the evaluation of a project, an outdoor street kind of theatre spectacle project that had a lot of young producers in 4 different locations. And I proposed to them that the evaluation should be done by those young producers interviewing each other about what they had got out of it. Because actually, first of all, they're much more likely to tell each other the truth than if someone like me went in and asked them, or indeed more likely, because that was never going to be my role. But if one of the artists they've just spent a year working with, ask them about their experience, there's already a lot of personal relationships there between the artist and there's a position of power there that makes it more complex for somebody to say what they think. Whereas if they're speaking to a peer, and then the peer is going, if the way I structured it is that they would interview each other, as it were. So each person gets interviewed and interviews. So I think there's a lot that can be done by that, around that. When you started talking, one of the things, for a long time, I was uncomfortable with and resisted the idea of colonialism, or the metaphor of colonialism, but partly because I wasn't clear about what its meaning might be. But I now, in these years, it's often in my mind as a word, and because I think I can often see the relationship that the professional arts world has with people it works with as a kind of colonial relationship. It sees them as other. It sees them as subjects, people exactly like, I mean, I'm try not to be provocative, but occasionally I make the comparison with missionaries. They so believe in their own faith that they fail to recognize that people already have their own faith when they go out to the colonies and try to convert them to their faith. And even though they're doing it with good intentions and so on, that relationship of inequality is so often embedded in. So the last thing I would say is that I think it's really important to ask people what they would like to know, to involve people in setting the research questions, asking what's interesting to you about this, as opposed to those, because actually defining what is being researched is a huge power, because it's the power to define knowledge and truth and what matters and what doesn't matter. And that power is generally held by the researchers, the educated, the people with relatively comfortable jobs. And I think part of that leveling agenda that I would say is so important in all of this, that's one of the ways in which we do it. So,
and I think that's probably what I meant when I was asking about ego. I think, maybe through education, or this sense of knowing more than, when you enter into a project with maybe a preconceived notion, or this sense that you can make it better, or you can do something for. And that interferes then with the possibilities or the potential, I think. And I think it imbalances the power dynamics. It doesn't become a co-created piece of work. And I think, you know, I guess what I was trying to get across there was not that I thought you had an ego in the way that you worked, but just that I thought that ego in general was one of the, what you're saying about colonialism in the art world. You know, if you go in thinking I'm going to make a piece of art with the community, it's the difference between participatory and community, I think, is how you described it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There was something I was going to say, but it's gone. Never mind.
Sorry.
No, it didn't. It wasn't important. It wasn't. No, I know. I was going to talk about vulnerability. I've become very interested in vulnerability in recent years, and I would now. I have adopted some strategies to make myself more vulnerable, because I know that I'm usually the least vulnerable person in the room for a whole set of reasons. And so, for example, when we're talking about research, one of the things that I didn't use consent forms when I started to do research, because I was naive and I didn't know what would be called correct procedures. Also, it was back in the days when those things weren't quite as rigid as they are now. Then I learned I should do, and then I started realizing what an oppressive thing a consent form is, and how the consent forms really only protect the researchers and the institutions they work for. They pretend to protect the people who are being researched, but actually they don't really, because the people who are being researched don't really have the power to act on the rights that are given to them in consent forms. So in working on the Regular Marvels books, I deliberately didn't use consent forms, and I simply told people, you can withdraw from this project up until the moment the book goes to print. After that, it's too late because it's gone. And we did, on the book that I did about artists in old age, working with a friend of mine, an artist called Nick Godley, who I'd asked to make portraits of people I was talking to. We did lose a portrait that he'd done, because when the person saw it, the second time she saw it, actually, first time she saw it, she was fine. I mean, she'd been photographed for it, and she'd chosen how she wanted to be. And then she said, I don't want it in the book. And I asked her why, and she just said, just vanity. And that was fine. It didn't go in the book, and that work was wasted, or, you know, it's never been seen. It will never be seen. But that's about me accepting the vulnerability. So I'm now doing work that I might not be able to use. So I'm giving the person I'm working with, I'm trying to give them the power to withdraw without any questions asked.
And the ownership.
Yeah.
I'll stop now. I'm going to mute myself.
In all the Regular Marvels, everyone had got to read either the whole text or the text that they were described in beforehand. And I didn't promise that I would change something I didn't have any difficulties, but if somebody had really objected, I would have changed it if they'd have given me a good reason, and vanity is as good a reason as any. I'm not going to print a painting of somebody that they think makes them look ugly. You know, why would I do that? But I would say, well, we'll negotiate it, because, you know, that's what it is. But in the end, if you're still not happy with what I'm prepared to write and say, then you can withdraw. You could just take it out and it won't be in.
Fascinating. Well, like we're out of time, and I'm sure you want to go have like a cup of tea or something. But I appreciate your participation, and I appreciate everyone's participation in this workshop and slash podcast. I'd like to thank everyone and thank Francois for his brilliant contribution, as well as your contributions for all use. And if you want, I'm going to be sending links to his work. He has 2 websites and has all of his projects up there, and his books are all freely available as well. So yeah, that's brilliant.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for your kind reception.
Thank you so much.